Question 1 of the evaluation by me, Jacob Dunlop. Comparison number 1 between my film and Snatch. Both starting out very similarly, very dark. Mine cuts to an establishing shot rather than a title. So in Snatch it goes straight into the scene. We don't have any establishing shots of other locations like mine does. But it does introduce the first two characters immediately. There they are, they're introduced equally in the framing and everything. Then we go to the dominant one. Mine does the exact same thing. And then we cut to the second character, which mine will do in just a second. There it is. And then back to the first character. And they're clearly the dominant one of the two. Their dynamic and everything is quite similar in mine. Their framing and they're very equal. Right, then the scene moves on in mine. So we here have the characters are all moving forward and the titles are there. I've got a few establishing shots which Snatch doesn't have. Then we've introduced another character in mine. He's very far away from him. Oh, now we're right up close. So, and then as soon as the third shot of him, we've got the other characters coming in. His introduction is not nearly as long. He is clearly a character that is there to be in relation to the first two. It's clearly not as important. Some movement in Snatch now. We're seeing all the different characters very slowly. Now on to the next scene in Snatch now. They're going into the room. This is the last scene. Just entering the last scene on mine now. It's where the action happens in both. So there's a bit of dialogue to begin with. And then it all just kicks off in Snatch. So in mine it's quite a bit slower, much more slow paced and gentle. There is action, you just saw that, but it was not nearly as much as Snatch. And the camera does the same to not show that, where it's going all over the place in Snatch. It's not doing the same in mine. The other titles are quite similar. Mine doesn't spin, but they're both imposed over the image. Now just a quick recap of that. The two films are very similar in their structure and their layout, and the way we've had two characters introduced, then the rest has sort of come in at once, and there's an action scene. I would say that mine generally is much slower than Snatch and has much less dialogue overall. There's the target audience is very the same. The differences I would say would be that mine has much brighter colours in the way I filmed it, and it looks more visually pleasing, I would say. I have quite a lot of establishing shots slowing the whole thing down, whereas in Snatch there aren't any shots of just the setting. And then in Snatch they've got a long voiceover, and mine has next to no dialogue whatsoever. Now we're into the second comparison between my film and Boys in the Hood. Boys in the Hood comes straight in with the title. It's not at the end of the scene, it's the absolute beginning of the film, and mine comes in with these establishing shots. There is a shot in Boys in the Hood of a stop sign. Here it is. That happens before any of the characters come in, quite similarly to my films. There's a very long shot of that before the characters are introduced. And there they are. Here are the characters now. We see the main character in Boys in the Hood. We see the main characters in mine. We're still quite far away from the main characters in Boys in the Hood. It's quite a long shot of the main characters just walking along. We hear the dialogue of what they're saying. And they've only really used, I think it's 2 shots so far in Boys in the Hood, whereas I've used quite a lot more. So now I've just come in a little closer to keep it more visually pleasing, I would say, so it's not to get boring. We've moved on in mine, we're on to the next scene. They're about to do that in Boys in the Hood now. They're talking, and that's what triggers into the next scene. It's very similar to mine, but mine happens much quicker. Right, now we're at the next scene with a new character here. Like I said in the last one, it's a very quick introduction of him before we move on to the next scene after him. He's clearly not as important as the rest. There's lots of shots of the location of this one scene in Boys in the Hood. This scene doesn't have much importance to the film, as this is the only scene where you see it, although there is quite a long scene, lots of shots of the location just to get that detail in. I'd say both films are very slow. Boys in the Hood, I'd say, is slower than mine. It's got a very slow pace. So now we're coming up to the action scene in mine, although if you can call it that. So yeah, we've just been stabbed. This is what introduces you to the characters as criminals, not as just youths. And in Boys in the Hood, they haven't done anything particular apart from just talk and walk, really. no actions happened, and that's the end of it. Just another quick recap here. I'd say between the similarities between the films are we have a very similar target audience. They both have a very slow pace. There's little to no action happening. Again, it's the same with the dialogue. Little to no dialogue going on. I'd say they both have much brighter colours than typical of British gangster films, and the characters are all both quite young, which is again not a thing that you'd find in British gangster films, although is not uncommon for hood films. I've got a lot of establishing shots in mine, whereas Boys in the Hood only has one. Mine has an amount of action, whereas in Boys in the Hood it is just dialogue and walking. Nothing of any visual significance happens. So now we have some shot comparisons between the three films now. So first off we have Snatch and Mime. This is the first shot of the two main characters for each of them. They are both composed equally in the frame. In Snatch they have almost the exact same costume. They're in the exact same position. The frame is very symmetrical. They're the same height. They're very equal looking. I'd say that's quite similar in mine, although they take up much less of the frame and much more of it is used to make it look nice. And I've used a good location. I've used a low angle to capture these nice, interesting lines and shapes to make it look good. Although the characters are the same, they're the same position, same equally in the frame. Another one from Snatch now, we cut to the two dominant characters of the two characters for each. They're not too different, although again it's similar to the first one. The Snatch, you come right up close to the main character, whereas in mine he is much more a part of his surroundings, and you can see that much more. You can see again you still have these visually interesting lines and bold colours. The Snatch is very dark, it's all dark browns and greys, and it's not that nice to look at, whereas mine I'd say is more so. Now between mine and Boys in the Hood, we're looking across the street at some characters, and in that sense they're quite similar. We're quite far away from the characters. They're all walking from one side of the screen to the other. Again, the colours for each of them are fairly bright. I'd say mine are a bit more brighter, a bit more interesting, although on the top they're not particularly dark. They're just kind of average in the middle. Now between mine and Snatch again, this is the characters moving from one scene to the next. So I would say in Snatch they've done this for much longer. My shots were much shorter, and we're sort of looking at the title now. It's much more bold and big in Snatch than it is in mine. Mine is a very small element in the bottom corner, whereas in Snatch it's much bigger. It's got a much more bold font. It's all caps, and it's really much more in the middle. It's much higher up in the frame. It's much more towards the centre, and it's much more grabbing your eyes. Now the main titles between Snatch and mine, they're both over the actual image of the film, which I think is quite interesting, and they're both moving as well. So this title stays the same as the actual image of the film is moving, which is quite interesting. They're both they're both as central as they can be. They're both quite big, bold fonts. They're clearly the main part of each shot. Now just a final recap of what I've done. Conventions that I've used are from hood films. I've used quite young characters, which is quite unusual for a British gangster film, but like I said, for a hood film that's not that unusual. I've got two main characters which I stick to throughout, and their relationship is quite a key part of the narrative. I've taken that from lots of British gangster films like Snatch. I've used very little dialogue, which is quite conventional for a hood film. I've developed the convention of the titles. I liked the idea of having titles over the image like in Snatch and many other British gangster films, but I didn't like the idea of them being so big and bold like they are in, say, Snatch or Sexy Beast. So I made them much smaller and much more elegant, and in bottom corners they were not a main part of the frame. I've challenged the convention of the colour. My colours are very bright and vivid throughout until the end, where the actual crime scene happens and it's introduced that this is maybe not so nice.